Hello, pattern readers. In this video, I'm going to be talking about book-to-screen changes in Season 1, Episode 6 of The Wheel of Time. The books I'm going to be talking about include all the way through parts of Book 3, The Dragon Reborn, plus parts of the prequel, New Spring. So if you're not okay with spoilers from those books, then I recommend going back and watching my book spoiler-free reaction and breakdown of Episode 6 instead. I've been really looking forward to talking about the changes in this episode because I think they're interesting. There are some that I really love and totally support, and others that I definitely was more mixed on or had a lot of questions about, especially when I first saw the episode. But I have gone back and watched it a couple of times, and that does help me understand some of them, so I'm just really looking forward to breaking that down with you. Of course, the most obvious major change in this episode is that we are introduced to and get to know the Amyrlin Seat, Siuan Sanche, as a character much sooner. And the wonderful thing is how much they managed to let us see about this character in only one episode. So let's look at what they did. They gave us one cold open scene with Siuan as a 10-year-old girl before she left her home in Tyr. We then get a scene of her as the Amyrlin Seat in front of the hall. The next scene we get of her is a private scene with Moiraine, where we understand the true nature of their relationship and the secrets that they're keeping. We also get a semi-private scene of her with Moiraine and Nynaeve and Egwene in her study. So she's much more at ease, much more herself. And then we get the final scene of her in the hall again, where we now have the knowledge of what the true relationship is between her and Moiraine. So it's basically 4 scenes with adult Siuan and another single scene with young Siuan. And in that, we've managed to learn a great deal about this character and her relationship with Moiraine. And through all of that, we've learned a great deal more about Moiraine as well. When we look at it that way and how much they were able to convey in a few scenes in a single episode, it's a lot. And I think if you look at what some non-book reader reactions are, they're going, this is great. We've learned so much about this character. She's really interesting. But also some of them are kind of wishing like, hey, I wish we'd had some of that kind of stuff with some of the other more central characters. And so that's a good point and something that I'm going to talk about later in this video. But why is it important to know Siuan sooner and to know her well? What they've done basically is they've pulled from different books to bring in some of these aspects, because you have the beginning of the Great Hunt is when we're first introduced to Siuan as the Amyrlin Seat. And around that point, we learn that she and Moiraine have been sharing this secret about the Dragon Reborn for the past 20 years. So that's tied right into the central plot of this season, the mystery and the search for who is the Dragon Reborn. And so it's great to have this character who, along with Moiraine, are the only two have been in on this mission from the beginning. And then also we're being introduced to White Tower politics through her role as the Amyrlin Seat. Now we're just scratching the surface there, but if we look at the whole series, Aes Sedai and White Tower politics are huge. They're a really huge deal throughout the whole series. So getting started with that sooner, starting to get an idea of the different Ajas and the factions and what kind of tenuous role Siuan is really in, even while she's also literally the most powerful woman in the world. It's a really interesting dynamic, and to start exploring it now makes sense. And then finally, you get the personal aspect of it, which for the fact that Moiraine is a central character in this season, getting to understand that side of her is huge. And then we get it from both of their perspectives, both Moiraine and Siuan. Now, this is something that they drew from the prequel, New Spring, but there are some differences there, so I really want to dig into that separately. So if you've been following my channel, you'll probably know that I was very much hoping that they would bring in this relationship between Moiraine and Siuan and expand on it from what's in the books, because there was so much potential there. And the other thing that's really wonderful about using this is that you're able to have really a pretty fully fleshed out romance, and we see the tragic side of it, again, in only one episode, because you're able to draw on these characters who have such history. So in the prequel New Spring, it is clear, unless you aren't really paying attention to the details as you're reading, that Moiraine and Siuan have a sexual relationship. They are referred to as pillow friends. Now, there are some readers out there who seem a little bit confused about what pillow friends are, but Robert Jordan did say very explicitly in an interview that pillow friends have sex. Yes, they're also very close friends. but there is a sexually intimate relationship between pillow friends as well. And that is the case for Moiraine and Siuan when they were in the White Tower together. So the change from the books is that instead of when they leave the White Tower in New Spring, there being a sort of assumption on both of their parts that their intimate relationship in that sense was not going to continue. And you even see Siuan as a character expressing some interest in being with men. Moiraine doesn't express it at that point, but Siuan does. And it sort of seemed like, okay, this is just what we both expect, that we're going to go out and we're going to go in separate directions. We're not going to maintain that intimacy. And if either of us is with someone else, like, that's okay. And that kind of goes along with the development of what Robert Jordan envisioned pillow friends to be. The change here is that instead, this relationship has matured and they have maintained their love, their romance in whatever degree they are able to through their separations over the past 20 years. It's a tragic one because they haven't seen each other in 2 years. And by the end of this episode, they think they're never going to see each other again. But we still can see when they're with each other, the joy that comes out in both of them. The trust and the intimacy that they have is something that is really unique because they are not able to be themselves with everyone in the world the way they are able to be with each other. I fully support this change because I think it adds so much for the characters, so many layers, and all we've really done is just allowed this relationship to continue and to mature into something a little more real. We were able to do that in one episode because of the history that these two characters share, that you couldn't do with any other character that they would just be meeting and starting to develop a relationship with. Now, I don't want to get into it too much because it does involve some later book spoilers, especially for Siuan. Later on in the series does have a more fully developed romance that we see sort of the beginnings of, and that has not begun at this point in the books whatsoever. So it is still something the show can explore if they want to. If they get to that point and things have developed such that that romance would still fit into the story, they could still include it or not. It really is going to depend on where they're going to go with the storytelling, but adding this change doesn't preclude that. So for this next little bit, I am going to just briefly mention a book spoiler from book 13, Towers of Midnight. So if you don't want to hear that part, just go ahead and skip to this timestamp on the screen. So I would say that this change to develop Moiraine and Siuan's romance probably does preclude Moiraine having a romance with Tom later. And it's not just that, but if we consider the fact that Moiraine and Tom have not met at this point in the show, they are not meeting in season 1. They did meet in book 1, and that laid some of the seeds in the groundwork, even though as book readers will generally agree that was not a well-developed romance, and many people did not see it coming whatsoever. Given that they've taken out those like early little seeds that could have been there and some opportunities to develop interactions between the two, and given that Moiraine is still actively in love with Siuan, and we can expect her to still at least go through that redstone doorway, which I am predicting would happen probably by the end of season 3, I don't really see how they can do it. And if we look at what happens with Moiraine and Tom in the books, we can't really just have them like all of a sudden in a romance after he rescues her from the tower much later in the series. So in my mind, if they're not starting it here, they're not going to include that at all. And I'm totally fine with that. It wasn't a well-developed romance. Their two choices were either develop it a lot more or just don't include it. And I think that's fine. And how they will handle that, I could speculate all day about that, but I think it depends on too many things that we don't know yet. Could still involve a lot of different possibilities. So don't assume that it means X, Y, or Z about how that later plotline is going to be handled, other than I'm pretty sure Moiraine and Tom are not going to have a romantic aspect to their relationship later on. So there are some other interesting aspects to these scenes that I've been talking about so far that I'll bring in before I go on and talk about other aspects of the episode. So in the very first scene in the hall with Logan, I like that they brought in Logan to this scene. They're essentially bringing in an element in the books that we don't see until book 2, The Great Hunt, where we learn that Logan is in the White Tower. He's sort of being watched and studied as a man who has been gentled. And we really don't get much from him in the book, but we can kind of gather that he's very depressed and he needs to be watched. Here we get to have this scene, very powerful scene, where Logan is throwing all of his bravado at Siuan and trying to find a way to get what he wants, which is to die. And it's a horribly sad scene, but we really feel for him, I think. I do, given everything we've seen from him. And this is a horrible position for anyone to be in. Even if you think he did terrible things, he still is in an emotional state that we would not wish on really anybody. So it was a powerful scene. I'm glad they brought that forward so we can start to get a sense of, what does it look like? What does it feel like to be a man who has been gentled, cut off from the One Power? People have some questions about this private scene between Moiraine and Siuan. Like, basically, where are they and how did they get there? Now, if you look at some of the Explore feature on the Amazon Prime page for the Wheel of Time, there's some information in there. There is an entry for this moment, and it does say that the picture, the painting in Moiraine's room, and we can see similar ones both in the hut that they're in and in Siuan's study, these are ter'angreal. So these are how they get to where they're going. They use the One Power to activate the ter'angreal, and then that takes them where they're going. Now, the way it's written on the Explore page, it sounds like they've actually, the ter'angreal are sort of like traveling devices, and they take them directly to an actual hut in Tyr. So if that's the case, then that's very interesting, because we didn't have something like that in the books. We didn't have a device that could make gateways for traveling. In fact, the whole concept of gateways and traveling was known in that it used to exist, but nobody had any idea how to do it or any idea of how to study that. And if they did have something like this, then that would at least give them something to study, to try and rediscover the ability to travel. And now it's also possible that if that's the way this ter'angreal works, that it only works for a very specific location. Like, you can't use it to travel to anywhere. It only basically travels from ter'angreal to ter'angreal. You know, so it's not like you can just use it to go anywhere. It would be like you can go wherever this other ter'angreal is, and that's it. So that would be my guess on how it works, which would make it much more limited and not like, hey, you can just use it to travel to anywhere, because obviously that would be a very different scenario. I don't think that's what we're dealing with here. The other possibility some people seem to think is that where they're going is not in the real world, it's in the world of dreams, Teleron Riyadh. And so that hut, maybe it really exists in Tyr, but the version of it that they're going to is actually in the world of dreams. That would be a much more dangerous undertaking. And I don't know, the Explore feature doesn't make it sound like that's what it is. I'm not sure that this really makes it any better from a lore standpoint, other than that we know that there are ter'angreal that help people access the world of dreams. And then we should talk about the use of the oath rod in the final scene in the hall. This was one of the things that I did have an issue with when I initially saw this scene, because I'm like, well, did they really need to use the oath rod? It kind of seemed like they didn't, and that was a little bit more for theatrics. It seemed kind of like an extreme thing to do for theatrics, to actually swear an oath on the rod. But Sarah Nakamura, the book consultant for the show, was asked about this. She did indicate that there was some other reason for using this. She didn't really get into it, but, you know, it definitely made me think a little bit more about why they did this in this scene. So one of, I think, the most important factors that I came across someone suggesting was that by swearing an oath on the oath rod, and especially given the way that Moiraine swore it specifically, it gives Moiraine perhaps a little bit more protection from being called back to the tower later on. If we get another woman in the Amyrlin seat, and Siuan knows that her position is precarious, then that woman can't just order Moiraine back to the White Tower. Moiraine can say, I swore an oath to Siuan Sanche, and she did not call me back. So, sorry, I guess I'm still exiled, can't come back. So by doing it that way, it does give Moiraine more protection to continue her quest and her mission, no matter what happens to Siuan. So that's a pretty compelling reason, and I think that might be what we're dealing with here. Now, let's look at the words that Moiraine actually said. She doesn't repeat exactly what Siuan says. Instead, she specifically swears to honor and obey Siuan Sanche, not the Amyrlin seat. So again, she is not beholden to any other Amyrlin seat. She's swearing herself to Siuan specifically. Given the emotional undercurrents in this scene, many people felt like this is almost like a marriage vow between them, where Moiraine is swearing to, again, the phrase honor and obey Siuan Sanche, and she's doing it in a magically binding way. Now, normally, that's a little bit intense, right? That you're swearing and binding yourself to someone magically in a way that really can't be broken. It's a pretty big deal. But it does show a level of trust where Moiraine trusts that Siuan is never going to abuse that power that she has over her. And again, there's the heartbreak because both of them think they're never going to see each other again. And maybe they're right. Some people are questioning, well, how does Moiraine get away with saying these very personal things in front of the hall? Isn't that going to cause problems? So I think there's a couple answers to this. Number one, I think the scene is framed in such a way that I think we're supposed to understand that not everyone could hear all of Moiraine's words, that she kept the really private parts much softer. She clearly raises her voice to a louder volume at the end, and then we should be able to assume that people can hear her at that point. So she's trying to, I think, keep the really key aspects of that between her and Siuan only. And then, to be honest, I think Siuan is going to get in trouble from this. Not necessarily because people now know the nature of her relationship with Moiraine, but look what she's done. She has specifically crossed the Blue Aja. She specifically did something that is exactly the opposite of what Maureen wanted. Maureen is the Blue Sister who spoke with Moiraine in the bathhouse. And I think we can gather from that scene that she is probably at this point the First Selector, the head of the Blue Aja, because she has the ability to order Moiraine to stay in Tarvalan, and Moiraine would have to listen to her otherwise. Siuan's support is kind of tenuous, and having the support of the Blues was maybe one of the few things she had going for her. And I'm guessing she doesn't have that now because she's now done something to make Maureen really angry. Now, we don't have any reason to think that Maureen was the First Selector in the book story at this point, but I think they're probably going to change what they're going to do with this character. Given what she mentioned about the ships out west and going out to investigate that, I think we can conclude that what she's going to find are Seanchan ships. And it's not unreasonable to think that she herself may end up as Damani. And it could be very powerful because we've seen her initially in the White Tower, a woman who holds a great deal of power. And if we then see what changes she has undergone as the result of this torturous experience of being held as a Damani by the Seanchan, it could be very powerful. Let's go to another scene that I initially had an issue with in this episode. And that is basically the scene where Moiraine discovers Rand and Mat, and she removes the dagger from Mat and pulls this darkness out of him. And then the dagger clangs on the floor and Lan covers it up. And after that, we don't see the dagger and we don't have any other mention of it. So this bugged me a lot when I first watched this episode. It probably was the thing that bugged me the most initially because I'm like, we need to know what is going to happen to this dagger, or at least I, as a book reader, need to know what is going to happen to this dagger. The one thing I will say about this is that it's quite possible, because of the way the episode ends, that is why this is also left unclear. So at the very end of the episode, we have Mat not going through the Waygate with everyone else. And the most likely explanation for this is that they didn't have Barney Harris. He was there to film episode 6. There was a long gap in filming. He most likely didn't come back to film episodes 7 and 8. So they probably had to use the footage they had and film a little bit of new stuff with the other actors at the end to make it clear that he didn't go through the Waygate. We didn't get an explanation of it at that point, but presumably they will try to provide some kind of explanation for this in the next couple of episodes. And it's also possible that to tie in with that, they might have removed something to do with the dagger in order to give themselves more options to explain what happens with Mat. So I like that they did leave their options open. I think that is important, and I can see lots of possibilities for how this will be handled going forward. But what I'm kind of hoping for is something along the lines of this in episode 7. Discussion among the group about why did Mat stay behind? Why didn't he come? Why didn't Moiraine try to stop him? Now, I think the explanation that is making the most sense for why he wouldn't go with them is the dagger. Moiraine took it from him and she severed that connection to some extent, but not completely. As she says, if he were to pick up that dagger again, he would be in trouble. So he is not completely safe from this dagger, and perhaps there is still a pull towards it that hasn't let go of him yet. This would be kind of similar to what happens in The Great Hunt, where he's been healed enough that the dagger can be taken away from him and he's okay, but the connection is not severed completely, but it buys him time. But he's still drawn to the dagger. He still can sense it. He still wants to follow it. So I kind of think that's the situation we're going to have here, where we could get something along the lines of Moiraine saying, he can't get that dagger. I put it in Tarvalan. It's being guarded. It's kept away from people. He can't get it. But what we could then later see is that even though he can't get at it, that it's going to keep him in Tarvalan. He knows where it is, he's drawn to it, and he's going to stay in the vicinity because it hasn't let go of him yet. And we could then get a scene at the beginning of season 2 where people have returned to Tarvalan and we're able to get a group together and fully sever Mat's connection to the dagger. But it would be, in the meantime, keeping him in Tarvalan, keeping him from going with his friends and keeping him from going back home to his sisters, for that matter. So, of course, there's other ways they could go with it. The main thing I would say is I hope that we get some lines of dialogue in episode 7 to address this question of where is Mat? Why did he stay behind? And, hopefully tying in the dagger somehow, if that is going to be part of the reason why he did not go. Then it can really tie into what they're going to do at the beginning of season 2 when there's going to be a new actor in the role. Okay, and so now I want to talk about another aspect of the changes in this episode that might be a little bit tougher for people, including myself to some extent. We got so much of Moiraine, so much of Siuan, and that was really wonderful. Especially, I think, we really got a sense of just how much this quest is important to them, how much they're willing to risk, how much they're willing to sacrifice to keep their intentions and their focus on the one thing that matters more than anything else. That's powerful. That helps us understand their characters and the story. So that's wonderful. But truthfully, we didn't get as much of other characters in this episode. It was a little bit like that in episode 5 as well. There was a lot of focus on Stepan and Lan, but we at least had a pretty strong B-plot in Perrin and Egwene with Aemon Valda and the White Cloaks. So I felt like episode 5 was a little bit more balanced. We also got a decent amount of Nynaeve in that episode, decent amount of Moiraine. So that episode was a little bit more balanced. So I was okay with, I think, Perrin and Egwene and Nynaeve not having as much this episode since they had a pretty good episode 5. Where I think we're maybe missing out the most is Rand and Mat and Loial. So for instance, the way the scene is framed with the two of them, we first get Moiraine, and she's sitting in a little tea shop, and we can kind of get the sense that she's doing her spy work, and the whole scene where she goes to them is framed from her perspective and her taking the dagger. They could have perhaps flipped that and instead began the scene with Rand and Mat, so we get a little bit more of the two of them, and then having Moiraine come in and take the dagger. For Loial, honestly, the biggest issue I have for him in this episode is that we don't really know why he's going with them to the ways. Just from a character motivation, like, why is he going with them? Why is he joining their group? What is it that makes him want to go with them and willing to undergo dangers to do it? We didn't really get that explanation. Probably we'll get more of that in episode 7, so I can kind of wait, but I think that is something that perhaps new viewers might be wondering about. And then finally, there's the use of the ways itself. So what we saw was Moiraine opening the waygate with the one power. There's a little nod to the way that the waygates are opened in the books, in that she forms a pattern with her weaves that looks like a trefoil leaf, which is how it's actually opened in the books, a physical key in the shape of a trefoil leaf. So the concept of the ways in the books is that anyone could access it. And there are ways to close them off so that not everyone can access it, but they were left open so that people could access them, whether they had the ability with the one power or not. Some people really don't like that change from a lore standpoint. I tend to think it probably doesn't matter as long as we get a reasonable explanation for it. For instance, I'd be totally fine with the idea that, hey, we used to be able to open these things with just a key, but ever since they became super dangerous, we sealed them off so that you couldn't access them that way, and you had to be an Aes Sedai to open it up, because otherwise you're asking for trouble. So if that's the reason, I'm totally okay with that. It's a change, but it's a change that makes sense. And then presumably, as we will probably learn in episode 7, the reason why we need Loial is because he's the one that can navigate the ways once they're inside. And so I'm expecting to get more of an explanation for how the ways work, maybe a little bit about their history in the next episode. I'm also hoping that it's going to be a real character-focused set of scenes in the ways because it's dark and there's not a lot happening in there. But we should really get to have these characters in close quarters and get to see some interesting dynamics between them. I'm really excited for episode 7. There's some things coming up that I can't wait to see. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode in the comments, as always. And subscribe and come back for more Wheel of Time videos. And until next time, keep those loins girded, my friends.